"I'm doing it properly right now," I said, getting down on one knee in the Boston Public Library reading room with string lights overhead and flowers on the table, and Emma looking at me like I was the most ridiculous and wonderful person she'd ever encountered. "Emma Patterson, I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you."
Story based on true events. Names, locations, and some facts have been altered to preserve the privacy of those involved.
There's something about working at Massachusetts General Hospital that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. At least, that's what I told myself every single morning when I walked through those iconic glass doors. My name is Dr. Marcus Sterling, and I'd spent the last 15 years climbing this particular ladder with surgical precision, arrogance, and an almost pathological need to be the best in every room I entered. The kind of surgeon who refused to waste his license on routine procedures. I didn't do appendectomies. I didn't do routine catheterizations. I was the guy they called when the case made other surgeons nervous, when the risk was astronomical and the failure rate was measured in double digits. That's where I belonged. That's where I'd always believed I had to be. The hospital had become my cathedral, and I was its high priest, celebrated and untouchable in my tower of expertise. My reputation preceded me everywhere. People whispered about my success rate, about the patients I'd saved from conditions that most physicians considered death sentences. I had the office with the view, the one that looked out over the Charles River, where I could see the sailboats on weekends that I never took off. I had the waiting list that stretched into the following year. I had the speaking invitations from medical conferences around the world, the research grants that universities competed to fund, the reputation that made me feel invulnerable. What I didn't have was any concept of what actually mattered. That Thursday night in November was like any other night for me, which is to say it was a night where I forgot to eat dinner while I was planning a surgical strategy, where I ignored 3 calls from my mother asking if I'd be at Thanksgiving, and where I felt that peculiar high that comes from knowing you're about to do something that very few people on Earth could actually accomplish. I just finished an 8-hour double reconstruction on a 15-year-old patient with a congenital heart defect so rare that only 3 hospitals in the entire country had even attempted it. The defect was a combination of anomalies that shouldn't have been survivable. Yet here we were, 8 hours of meticulous work later, and the kid's heart was actually beating, actually working, actually giving him a second chance at a life that had always been defined by its limitations. My hands were still remembering the precision of the work, that almost meditative state where everything else disappears, and it's just you, the anatomy, and the razor-thin borderline between life and loss. I was heading down to the cafeteria for the coffee that would probably become my dinner, maybe my breakfast too, when I passed by the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. I didn't work in the ICU. That wasn't my domain. The ICU was where the nursing staff fussed over vital signs and bedpans and held hands with families. It was where medicine became something gentle, and gentleness has never been my strength. I'd always thought of ICU nurses as good people, sure, essential, important in their way, but not in the way a surgeon was essential, not in the way I was essential. We lived in different universes, and I'd never questioned whether mine was actually the better one. That condescension would cost me everything I thought I was, but I didn't know that yet. The first sign something was wrong was the hum dying. You know that sound that lives in hospitals? That constant low-frequency background noise of machines doing their jobs, of monitors beeping, of ventilators whooshing, of the entire technological infrastructure keeping death at a distance. It just stopped. One second it was there, and the next second it wasn't. And in that instant of silence, before anyone really understood what was happening, the backup generators didn't kick in. They were supposed to kick in. I learned later that someone had been doing maintenance work on the electrical systems, and there'd been a miscommunication between departments, classic hospital bureaucracy, and the redundancy that's supposed to protect a hospital like Mass General simply wasn't there when it mattered most. The chaos that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my controlled, sterile world of surgery. This wasn't the kind of crisis where you had time to plan your response. This was the kind of crisis where every second mattered, and everything you thought you knew became immediately irrelevant. The monitors in the ICU went dark, every single one. The alarms that had been beeping their individual songs a moment before just died. The ventilators, the machines that were literally breathing for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves, went silent, and there was screaming, Not full-on panic screaming yet, but the kind of confused urgency that happens when highly trained people suddenly find themselves without their essential tools. The sound of chaos disguised as professionalism, because nurses are trained to not panic, but their voices still betrayed the underlying fear. I should have walked away. That wasn't my area. That wasn't my problem. Marcus Sterling didn't involve himself in ICU crises. Marcus Sterling called the on-call resident and went home to his apartment overlooking the river and his expensive scotch and his complete absence of meaningful relationships. But I didn't walk away. Something pulled me through those double doors. Maybe just professional instinct. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something that existed before rational thought. Maybe fate was already rewriting my story, and I just didn't know it yet. The ICU was lit only by the emergency lights. These sad, dim red bulbs that made everything look like it was happening underwater, like we'd all been transported to some emergency room in a nightmare. I could see nurses moving between beds, looking like ghosts in that terrible light, trying to keep track of patients who'd suddenly become invisible to technology. One of them was kneeling beside a bed in the corner unit, and even in that horrible lighting I could see her hands were moving with absolute intention. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't running around looking for solutions or checking in with other staff members. She was being the solution. There was a patient in that bed, an older gentleman named Walter, I learned later, who'd been admitted 3 days earlier with septic shock. Septic shock is bad enough when you have all your technology. Septic shock without monitors becomes a guessing game played at the edge of death. His daughter stood at the end of the bed, tears streaming down her face, watching her father fade, watching the machines that had been keeping him alive just go dark. The woman had an ancient stethoscope hanging around her neck, not one of the fancy digital ones, but the old-fashioned kind that probably predated her entire career, and a flashlight that she was somehow managing to hold without using her hands. When I got closer, I realized she was literally holding it in the corner of her mouth. The light beam pointed at the patient's chest at exactly the right angle, giving her just enough visibility to work. She was doing something I'd never seen before. Performing medicine without any of the technology I'd spent my entire career depending on. He's tanking, I heard myself say, which was brilliant medical analysis. Really earned my medical degree with that one. The woman looked up at me, and everything changed. Even in that horrible red light, I could see her eyes. That's the thing about this moment that I've never been able to fully explain to anyone, not even the therapist I started seeing later, who specialized in life-altering moments. It wasn't like just looking at someone. It was like being recognized by someone. Like whatever cosmic thing was happening in this hospital had introduced us to each other on some level that existed before words, before reputation, before all the defenses I'd built up over 15 years of climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong wall. His last blood pressure was 78/48, she said, and her voice was steady. No tremor, no fear, no panic, just information and intention and absolute clarity. When the monitors died approximately 4 minutes ago, he was starting to crash. I've got him at about 82/52 with manual vitals every 90 seconds. His oxygen saturation seems to be stabilizing, but I need to keep monitoring his respiratory pattern. She was doing the impossible. She was maintaining continuity of care for a critically ill patient without any of the equipment that modern medicine depends on, like oxygen, depends on lungs. The flashlight wiggled slightly as she continued speaking, the light beam dancing across Walter's ashen face as she spoke. She had one hand maintaining a manual pulse point at the radial artery, her fingers counting off seconds with a precision that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times before, even though I somehow knew she'd never had to do this before. Not like this, not in darkness, not with a man's life in her hands and no backup plan. "Who are you?" I asked, which in retrospect was the most important question I've ever asked in my entire life. Even more important than, "Will you marry me?" which would come later. Even more important than the moment I'd say, "I'm sorry for who I was." "I'm Emma," she said. "I'm the overnight ICU nurse, and you're Dr. Sterling, the surgeon who doesn't usually come down here." There was no accusation in her voice, no judgment about my absence from this part of the hospital. No resentment about the implicit hierarchy that kept surgeons in their towers and nurses in the trenches. Just a statement of fact, delivered with complete calm while she was quite literally keeping a man alive with nothing but knowledge, calm, and 2 hands that never stopped moving. One hand was maintaining a manual pulse point, The other was holding an IV line that she was physically stabilizing against her own body. And somehow, she was also managing Walter's medication count in her head, reciting times and dosages to her colleague without breaking focus on what her hands were doing. I felt something crack inside my chest, not metaphorically. Literally. It felt like the architecture of who I thought I was just fractured, like the load-bearing walls of my identity had suddenly shown themselves to be made of paper. The backup generators, I started to explain, as if explaining the technical failure would somehow make me less useless in this moment, less irrelevant, less small. I know about the generators, Emma said. She glanced up at me again, and in that glance, I saw something I'd never encountered in the gleaming operating rooms of Massachusetts General, in the research labs, in the staff meetings where I'd held court like some kind of medical philosopher. I saw someone who knew exactly what she was doing, who didn't need my expertise, who didn't need my reputation or my accomplishments. And yet, and this is the part I still can't quite explain, she was somehow inviting me to be part of something real anyway, to be part of something that mattered in a way my surgeries mattered, but in a completely different dimension. Are you just here to tell me we have a problem? Or are you here to help solve it? The arrogance I'd worn like armor for so long suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It felt like drowning in your own self-importance. What do you need? I asked. For the next 3 hours, we worked together in that strange red emergency light. Emma would give me instructions, and I would follow them. Actually follow them, not the way I followed residents in surgery where I was always looking for what they did wrong, always maintaining this position of superiority. I was learning from her, a nurse in the ICU, a woman whose name I'd learned moments earlier. A woman who was teaching me the difference between being smart and being useful, between knowing something and understanding something, between performing medicine and actually caring for someone. She had me monitoring Walter's breathing manually. She taught me how to count the rate, how to listen with the stethoscope for the quality of breath sounds, how to distinguish between sounds that meant something was improving and sounds that meant we were running out of time. She showed me how to check capillary refill by pressing on Walter's fingernail and watching how long the blood took to come back. Ancient techniques, basic nursing, the kind of thing they'd probably mentioned in medical school during the week when I was attending a conference on something more important, something I'd decided was more worthy of my attention than these fundamental skills. Emma moved through the ICU like someone who'd learned long ago that sometimes your hands and your voice and your presence are the only technology that matters. There was a patient 2 beds over, a woman recovering from a stroke, who started to show signs of distress. Emma was there before any of us realized what was happening, talking to her in this voice that was simultaneously calming and compelling, explaining what was happening, asking her to focus on breathing, making her presence become medicine. She wasn't just managing symptoms, she was managing fear, she was managing hope. She was doing something I'd never really considered doing before, and I realized in that moment how hollow my own interactions with patients had become. The woman who'd had the stroke was named Margaret, and she was terrified. The darkness was triggering something, and her blood pressure was climbing, and Emma just pulled a chair over and sat beside her bed and talked to her about Margaret's grandson in Portland, Oregon, and about the garden Margaret wanted to plant in the spring. And slowly, I watched this happen in real time. The fear transformed into something else. Not comfort exactly, but connection. Not peace exactly, but purpose. Margaret knew that Emma cared about whether she lived or died, and somehow that knowledge made the difference. Around midnight, one of the backup generators finally came online, but it was only partial. Power to certain sections of the hospital, but not others. The ICU was still in that strange, dim state, still operating at half capacity. The nurses had to make decisions about which patients got priority for the limited power available. It should have been a crisis moment, but Emma moved through it like she was conducting an orchestra. She consulted with the other nurses, she explained the situation to the patients' families, she somehow made every person feel like they'd been considered, like their life mattered equally, even though mathematically that was impossible. That's when something shifted in me, not gradually, like a door opening that I'd always kept locked. I understood in that moment with sudden crystalline clarity that I'd spent my entire career looking in the wrong direction. I'd been measuring success by complexity, by the rarity of the case, by how many people said my name in hushed, reverential tones. Emma was measuring success by whether someone lived or died, by whether a patient's daughter stopped crying, by whether Walter's oxygen saturation stabilized enough that he made it until the generators came back online. We were both practicing medicine, but we were measuring ourselves by completely different metrics, and hers actually meant something. The full power came back around 3 a.m. The monitors illuminated, the ventilators resumed their mechanical breathing. The hospital suddenly had all its technology again, and it was like watching the world flicker back into focus. But something had shifted in the way I saw that world. The monitors showing Walter's vitals suddenly felt less important than the fact that Emma had kept him alive through the hours when those monitors were useless. The technology felt like a crutch I'd learned to use instead of developing the actual medical skills that existed underneath it. When the emergency lighting finally brightened and all the monitors came back to life across the entire ICU, Walter's blood pressure read 84/53. Not perfect. Not the numbers we would have aimed for if we'd had all our tools, but alive, stable, improving. The woman who'd kept him alive stood there, looking tired in a way I'd never noticed nurses looking before, and I realized that looking tired that way meant you'd just spent 3 hours holding someone's life in your hands while the world forgot you existed, while I'd forgotten you existed. "You can go," Emma said to me, and she was already moving to the next patient, already doing the next impossible thing, already being the person that this hospital actually depended on but never acknowledged. "You probably have surgeons waiting for you or grand rounds or something important." I didn't go. Instead, I stayed in the ICU until the morning shift arrived. I watched Emma work through every minute of it. I watched her explain to each patient what was happening, not the clinical explanation you'd get from a textbook, but the human explanation. She held Mr. Patterson's hand while his test results came back and the news wasn't good, and I watched her sit with his fear and his hope at the same time, validating both. She sat with Mrs. Chen while she cried about missing her grandchildren, and instead of offering hollow comfort, Emma just listened and let the woman's love for her family breathe. She made jokes with the night security guard when he did his rounds, jokes that made his face relax in a way that said people rarely did that for him, that he rarely felt like he mattered to people in nice clothes and important jobs. Around dawn, when the ICU finally settled into the rhythm of morning and Emma was finishing her charting, looking like she'd just run a marathon but somehow still managing to smile at a new patient being admitted, I asked her to have breakfast with me. "I don't really have breakfast with surgeons," she said, not unkindly. "You all live in a different universe." "I'm starting to think I've been living in the wrong universe," I said, and I meant it in a way that probably wasn't appropriate for a conversation in a hospital hallway at 6 in the morning, but I couldn't seem to help myself. Something about this woman had reached past all my defenses and was asking me questions I'd been avoiding my entire professional life. She looked at me for a long moment. In the morning light coming through the hospital windows, the real sunlight, not the emergency red lights, not the artificial glow of machines, I could see her properly for the first time. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, dark enough that it looked almost black in certain light. There was a small scar on her forehead that I wanted to know the story of, and I made a mental note to ask her about it someday. She had the kind of face that was probably prettier without thinking too hard about it. The kind of beauty that lives in bones and intelligence rather than in makeup or carefully constructed presentation. She had the kind of face that made me understand why people write songs and paint pictures and make fools of themselves in movies and books. "Okay," she said finally, "but we're going to the cafeteria, and I'm getting real food, not whatever fancy coffee drink surgeons get. I need protein and carbs and enough calories to replace what I just burned keeping a man alive." We went to the cafeteria, and Emma ordered eggs and toast and orange juice and bacon and a biscuit, and she ate like someone who'd spent the night doing real work, like someone who understood that fuel was just as important as technique. I ordered the same thing, and we sat there in the chaos of the morning shift change, nurses coming off night shift looking exhausted, morning staff coming in looking impossibly fresh, and she told me about her work in palliative care before she'd transferred to the ICU. She told me about patients she'd held while they died, about families she'd sat with, about the moment she decided that complexity wasn't the same as importance. "Medicine isn't about being the smartest person in the room," she said, stealing one of my toast triangles because apparently that was something we were doing now, and I found myself not minding at all. "It's about being the most present person. It's about showing up, Really showing up, not just physically, not just with your credentials and your reputation, actually being there. And I sat there, listening to this woman tell me the truth I'd been avoiding my entire professional life, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a medical student, excited about helping people instead of impressed with myself. I felt like maybe I'd been looking at the world wrong, like maybe there was a version of me that could exist where success meant something different, where success meant that Margaret wasn't alone when she was afraid, where success meant that Walter made it through the night, where success meant that Emma went home knowing she'd done something that mattered. "Can I see you again?" I asked her. "Not at the hospital." Actually, away from the hospital? Like somewhere normal where we could just talk and you could tell me more about how you see the world? Emma smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me understand why people write songs and why Nicholas Sparks built his entire career around moments just like this one. It was genuine and slightly uncertain, like she was taking a chance on me even though she had every reason not to. "Yeah," she said. "I think you could probably use someone to help you figure out how to be a human being again." What neither of us knew in that moment was that figuring out how to be a human being was going to become the most dangerous, exhilarating, complicated, and absolutely necessary journey of both our lives. Because fate doesn't just introduce you to someone for no reason. Destiny doesn't just rewrite your story for fun. When you meet someone who changes the direction of your entire life in the darkness, when you meet someone who shows you who you could actually be instead of who you thought you had to be, when you meet someone whose presence makes you understand that you've been living in a dream the entire time, that's not just luck. That's when everything begins. The coffee shop on Charles Street became our place within 2 weeks. Not because we planned it that way, but because it was exactly halfway between Massachusetts General and Emma's apartment in Beacon Hill, and because the owner, a woman named Rosa who'd survived both cancer and divorce and had opinions about everything, started saving us the corner table by the window. Our table. The one that looked out onto the street where Boston's history lived in the brick and cobblestone, where couples walked holding hands and tourists consulted maps, and life happened at a pace that had nothing to do with hospital emergencies or surgical schedules. I'd never had our table before. I'd never had time for coffee shops or the kind of conversations that happened in them. My life had always existed in hospitals and operating rooms and the occasional medical conference where I'd presented research to rooms full of people looking for permission to be impressed with me. Now I was discovering that there was an entire universe of living happening outside those walls, and Emma was my guide. "You're going to give yourself an ulcer if you keep stirring your coffee like that," Emma said, watching me with the kind of amusement that suggested she found my anxiety both endearing and slightly ridiculous. "It's just coffee. It's not a surgical procedure." She was right, of course. Everything Emma said seemed to come with this quality of truth that made you realize you'd been lying to yourself your entire life. We were sitting across from each other, and I was aware of every detail of the moment with an intensity that suggested I was experiencing coffee for the first time. The way the afternoon light hit her face, the way her hair had escaped slightly from the bun she kept it in, the way she wrapped her hands around the mug like she was holding warmth itself. "I'm nervous," I admitted, which was something the old Marcus Sterling would never have said out loud to anyone. The old Marcus Sterling didn't feel nervous. The old Marcus Sterling felt confident and superior and completely separate from the kind of vulnerability that characterized regular human beings. "I don't really know how to do this." "Do what? Sit in a coffee shop? Have a conversation? Be a person?" She was teasing me, but there was kindness underneath it. Emma had this ability to call you out on your bullshit, while simultaneously making you feel like you were worth being called out. "Date," I said. "I don't know how to date. I haven't dated anyone since medical school. I've had relationships, if you can call them that, but they were all with women who were impressed with my credentials, who wanted to be with the idea of me rather than with me. And I've never had to worry about disappointing them because we never actually got close enough for disappointment to be possible." Emma set down her coffee. "So what you're telling me is that you've spent the last 15 years accumulating accomplishments instead of accumulating experiences with other people." "Yes," I said. "And now you want to accumulate an experience with me." "Yes," I said again. "Okay," she said. "Then we should probably start with something simple. You could tell me about a moment in your life that didn't involve surgery." So I told her about learning to ride a bike when I was 7 years old, about how my father had held the back of the seat and then let go without telling me, and I'd gone about 30 feet before crashing into a rosebush. I told her about the moment I realized I was going to be a doctor. It was in the 7th grade, watching a documentary about Jonas Salk developing the polio vaccine, and I'd felt this sense that my life had purpose before I'd even lived any of it. I told her about my mother, who was a poet and who'd never understood why I chose something as practical as medicine, but who still came to every milestone moment of my career, even though she brought her friends and they'd sit in the back of the lecture hall making notes about the human drama of surgery. And Emma listened. Not the way people usually listen to me, which is with a kind of performance interest, like they're mentally preparing their response or assessing whether your story is impressive enough to repeat. She listened like my words mattered, like my life mattered. Like the 7-year-old boy who crashed into a rosebush was just as interesting as the surgeon who'd performed a rare cardiac reconstruction. Over the next 3 weeks, we fell into a routine that felt both impossible and inevitable. After Emma's overnight shifts, we'd meet for breakfast. On the days I wasn't scheduled for surgery, I'd find excuses to be in the ICU, ostensibly to check on patients, but really to watch Emma work, to learn from her, to understand this way of being in the world that prioritized presence over performance. It was during one of these shifts that I noticed something I should have seen coming. There was a nurse named Connor who worked the day shift in the ICU, and he had this way of being around Emma that suggested there had been history. The kind of history that involved knowing each other's coffee orders and laughing at inside jokes and the casual intimacy that only comes from time spent together. "Who is that?" I asked her one afternoon, trying to sound casual and completely failing. Emma was quiet for a moment. "That's Connor. We were engaged 3 years ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Engaged? It didn't work out," she said. "He wanted me to prioritize his career. He's actually quite accomplished, very respected in the nursing world, got offered a position at Johns Hopkins, and he wanted me to move with him. I didn't want to leave Boston. I didn't want to make my life about his accomplishments. So we ended it." "Do you regret it?" I asked, and I hated how much I needed to know the answer. "No," she said, "but Connor does. He calls sometimes. He sends emails about how he's made a mistake, how he misses me, how he wants to try again. He thinks that if he just keeps trying, eventually I'll change my mind." I watched Connor across the ICU, watching Emma, the way his eyes followed her, the way he clearly wanted her to look at him the way she'd started looking at me. "He's in love with you," I said. "He's in love with the idea of me," Emma corrected. "He's in love with how I made him feel about himself." It's not the same thing, but I could see the tension in her face. I could see that his presence complicated things for her, even if she didn't want to admit it. And I understood in that moment that love wasn't just about the person you were with. It was also about all the people who might want to be with you, all the alternative timelines that existed right alongside your current reality. 2 days later, I was in my office when my assistant buzzed me. "Dr. Sterling, there's a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent." I looked up from the research papers I'd been reviewing. I'd been reading more about palliative care and end-of-life care, trying to understand the medical philosophy that Emma lived by. And I saw her. Tall, blonde, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. She looked at me like she owned the room, like the years since we'd dated had just been a temporary separation that had now been rectified. "Vanessa," I said, and I couldn't keep the surprise out of my voice. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa had been my on-and-off girlfriend for about 18 months during my fellowship. She was an orthopedic surgeon at another hospital, brilliant and ambitious and completely hollow, in a way that I'd somehow not noticed when I was around her. Or maybe I'd just recognized myself in that hollowness and mistaken it for compatibility. "I transferred," she said, sitting down in my chair like she'd never left, "to Mass General. I wanted to be closer to you. I realized that I made a mistake, that we were good together. Vanessa, we weren't good together. We were convenient for each other. There's a difference." "Is this about that nurse?" she asked, and there was something cold in her voice. "Emma, I've heard about her. Everyone's talking about it. They're saying you've lost your mind, that you're slumming it with someone from the ICU. That's not—" I started, but Vanessa cut me off. "Marcus, think about this rationally. You're a cardiothoracic surgeon. You need someone who understands that world. Someone who gets what it means to be at this level. A nurse is never going to understand the complexity of what you do. Something in me snapped. Not violently, but with a kind of clarity that I'd been building toward since that night in the darkness. You know what I've learned? I don't need someone who understands my world. I need someone who understands me. And Emma does. She sees me, not Dr. Sterling, the accomplished surgeon, but Marcus, the person who's been lost his entire life and didn't even know it. Vanessa stood up. She looked at me like I was someone she didn't recognize. You're making a mistake. You're throwing away everything we built. We didn't build anything, I said. We just existed in proximity to each other. There's no foundation there, just residue. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, looking out at the view of Boston that had always made me feel important. And I realized something. The view was the same, but I was different. Everything I was looking at was the same, but it had lost some of its meaning. The height didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the person you wanted to share the view with. I went down to the ICU and found Emma checking on Mrs. Chen, who'd been in for 2 weeks now and had become something of a favorite patient. Her granddaughter had just arrived from Singapore, and Emma had orchestrated this beautiful moment where the family could have privacy, could sit together without anyone pretending that dying was anything other than what it was. A passage, a transition, a moment of profound human significance. Can we talk? I asked. We went to the break room, a depressing little space with a microwave that never quite smelled clean and a refrigerator full of abandoned lunch containers. And I told Emma about Vanessa's visit. I told her what Vanessa had said about slumming, about Emma not understanding my world. Emma was quiet for a moment. Is she right? She asked. Are you going to resent me eventually for not being able to be your intellectual equal in your field? No, I said. Because I've realized my field isn't actually what matters, and you are my intellectual equal. You think about medicine in a deeper way than I ever did. You've been thinking about the human cost of healing while I was thinking about technical precision. If anything, I'm playing catch-up. She's also right about one thing, Emma said. This is complicated. You work here. I work here. We see each other in this specific context where you've been learning a completely different way of being in the world. What happens when the excitement of that discovery wears off? What happens when you go back to your research and your surgeries and your life? Will you still want this? I don't know, I said honestly, but I want to find out. I want to spend enough time with you to actually know you, not just to be impressed by you or grateful to you or learning from you. I want to actually know you. Emma looked at me for a long moment. Okay, she said, but we should probably do something that's not about the hospital, somewhere we can just be two regular people. That's how, 3 days later, we ended up at a farmer's market in Cambridge on a Saturday morning. It was such a normal thing, wandering between tables of vegetables and artisanal bread and local honey, but it felt revolutionary to me. Here, I was nobody. No one knew I was a surgeon. No one cared about my accomplishments. I was just a man pushing a cart, following a woman around, watching her select tomatoes like she was choosing art. You're very particular about your produce, I said, laughing as she rejected the third batch of tomatoes. Life's too short for mediocre tomatoes, she said. And also, okay, I might have control issues about vegetables. Connor used to say I was ridiculous about this. There it was again, Connor. This ghost of a previous relationship that kept appearing in our story like a secondary character who wouldn't exit stage left. Do you want to get back together with him? I asked. I didn't want to ask. I wanted to be the kind of person who didn't need to ask. But I'd learned from Emma that sometimes honesty mattered more than pride. No, she said, but I do owe him honesty. We ended things in a specific way, and I think he's been holding on to hope that I never actually gave him. He deserves to know that I'm moving on. That I'm moving on with you, actually, if you want me to be moving on with you. Yes, I said. I want that. We bought the tomatoes and walked through Cambridge, and I felt like I was learning how to be a person for the first time. Not a surgeon, not an ambitious climber of professional ladders, just a person, someone who could exist in moments without needing to achieve something, without needing to be impressive, without needing to prove anything. That evening, I went home to my apartment, the one with the view I'd loved so much just weeks earlier, and I looked at it with fresh eyes. It was too perfect, too sterile, too much like a museum dedicated to the achievements of Dr. Marcus Sterling rather than a home where a person actually lived. I started moving things around, getting rid of the tchotchkes and awards, creating space for something else, for someone else, for life that was actually lived rather than displayed. On Sunday, Emma told me that Connor had asked to meet with her. They'd planned to have coffee at a place near her apartment. She invited me to come, which I appreciated. She wasn't hiding this from me. She wasn't making me wonder what they talked about or what he said. She was bringing me into the complexity. When Connor arrived at the coffee shop, he did a double-take seeing me sitting at the table with Emma. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, realization, something that might have been resignation. "I didn't know Marcus would be here," he said. "I wanted him to be here," Emma said, "because what I'm about to tell you needs to be witnessed, needs to be real." Connor sat down, and Emma took his hand. "Connor, I love you. I'll probably always have a special place for you in my heart. But I'm not in love with you. I haven't been in love with you for a long time, and I don't think I ever will be again. And I think you know that. I think part of you has always known that, which is why you keep coming back. Because you're hoping that if you just try hard enough, you can rewrite the story. But I can't be that story for you. You deserve someone who chooses you completely, not someone you're trying to convince." Connor looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at me. "How long have you two been together?" "About a month," I said, "And you're already serious enough that she's having this conversation with me," he said. It wasn't a question. Emma squeezed his hand. "I'm doing this because I owe you honesty. I'm doing this because I actually care about you. But I'm moving forward, Connor. I'm moving forward with my life, and I'm doing it with someone who sees me completely." After Connor left, and he did leave quietly, with a kind of grace that made me respect him in a way I hadn't expected, Emma and I sat in the coffee shop, and something shifted. The uncertainty that had been hanging over us evaporated. Connor was no longer a ghost. He was a person who'd mattered, who still mattered on some level, but who wasn't going to be part of this story going forward. Over the next month, things between us intensified in every way. We started spending most nights together. Emma would finish her shift and come to my apartment, and I'd cook her breakfast. Nothing fancy, just eggs and toast mostly, because I was learning that fancy wasn't the point. And we'd sit on my balcony watching the Charles River and talking about everything. About medicine, about our families, about what scared us, about what we wanted from life. The opposition to our relationship became more apparent as time went on. In the hospital, there were whispers. People asking if Emma was using me for connections, if she was trying to use a relationship with a surgeon to advance her career. People asking if I'd lost my mind, if I was having some kind of midlife crisis, if I was going to wake up one day and realize that I'd made a terrible mistake. One afternoon, I overheard someone in the surgical lounge say that I was slumming it, that I'd probably get it out of my system eventually, that these things never last between people from different worlds. I wanted to say something, to defend Emma and defend us, but I also knew that words wouldn't matter. Actions would. Time would. The continuation of our relationship in the face of opposition would. What I didn't know was that opposition was about to take a much more personal and aggressive form. I was in my office reviewing patient files when my assistant buzzed me again. Vanessa had come back. This time she wasn't alone. She had flowers and a smile and a story about a challenging case that needed my opinion. She positioned herself in my office in a way that was clearly meant to be flirtatious, and when I tried to politely usher her out, she leaned in and said, "I've been thinking about you. I think we were something important. I think you're making a mistake with Emma, and I'm here to remind you what you could have. Vanessa, I appreciate the flowers, but Marcus, think about this. We understand each other. We're equals. Your family is asking about you. Your mother called my mother wondering what was going on with you. They're worried you've lost perspective." Something about that broke through whatever polite veneer I was maintaining. My personal life is not up for family discussion, and my relationship with Emma is not something that needs external validation, and I need you to leave my office now. She left, but not before saying something that would stay with me for weeks. "She's going to hold you back, Marcus. That kind of love? It's beautiful in theory, but it's suffocating in practice. She'll make you want to be less than you are." That evening, I told Emma about it. I expected her to be upset, to demand that I do something, to have some kind of reaction that would validate how angry I felt on her behalf. Instead, she was quiet. "Do you believe that?" she asked. "That I'm holding you back?" "No," I said. "Do you?" "No," she said. "But I think it's important that we both know what we're up against. This is real opposition, Marcus. This isn't just gossip. This is people invested in a certain version of who you are, and they're not going to let that version go easily. Then we'll fight for this," I said. "We'll fight for us." Emma looked at me, and I could see something shift in her face. Something that looked like she was moving from wondering if this could work to knowing that it could, to deciding that it would. "Okay," she said. "Let's fight for this." But before we could really prepare for that fight, before we could strategize or fortify ourselves, something happened that nobody saw coming. Something that would change the trajectory of our entire story and transform what we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. I was in the middle of a particularly complex surgery, a double valve replacement on a patient with pulmonary hypertension, when my vision started to get fuzzy. At first, I thought it was just the reflection off the surgical lights, but then the room started to spin, and I felt my hands beginning to shake. I called for another surgeon to take over, which I'd never done before in the middle of a critical procedure. Everyone in the OR immediately recognized that something was wrong. You don't step back from major surgery unless something is genuinely critical. They got me to a chair. Someone was calling for a nurse. I could hear the commotion around me, but it sounded like it was happening underwater. My heart was racing, but I could feel my blood pressure dropping. Everything was wrong and right at the same time, and for the first time since that night of the blackout, I didn't feel like the most important person in the room. Emma appeared. I don't know how she got there so quickly, but she appeared, and suddenly I wasn't terrified anymore. She was checking my vital signs, speaking to the ER resident who'd come up to see what was happening, asking me questions with that same calm presence she'd shown Walter in the darkness. "We need to get him downstairs," she said. "I think he's having a cardiac event." As they were wheeling me down to the ER, as I was being transferred to a bed and attached to monitors, as doctors were ordering tests and EKGs and blood work, Emma never left my side. She held my hand, and she looked at me, and she said something that would change everything. "You're going to be fine," she said. "But whatever this is, whatever's happening, we're going to get through it together. You're not alone anymore, Marcus. You don't have to do this by yourself." And in that moment, lying in a hospital bed with machines monitoring my heart, I understood something that all my years of medical school and surgery and achievement had never taught me. I understood that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about having someone who would stay with you in the darkness. It was about connection and vulnerability, and the radical act of letting someone else matter more than your own independence. The tests came back. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't a major cardiac event. It was anxiety, pure physical anxiety that had manifested itself as a cardiac episode. The irony wasn't lost on me. The great surgeon, brought down by the fear of losing someone, by the fear that what we had built together was too fragile to survive the world's opposition. But as Emma sat with me in that hospital room, holding my hand, making jokes about how karma had a sense of humor, I realized something else. The fear was proof that this was real. The fear was evidence that I actually had something to lose now, which meant I actually had something worth fighting for. "I want to marry you," I said. "Not romantic, not planned, just honest." Emma laughed. "Marcus, you're on anxiety medication and you haven't eaten in 6 hours." "I know," I said, "but I still mean it. I want to marry you. Not someday. Now, as soon as possible." "You need to recover first," she said. "You need to get out of this hospital and actually be okay for at least 24 hours before we start making life-altering decisions." But I could see in her eyes that she wanted the same thing. That she'd been waiting for me to say it. That she'd been ready for weeks, just waiting for me to catch up. This was the moment. This was the peak that everything had been building toward, though neither of us knew it at the time. This wasn't the romantic moment of a first kiss under carefully constructed lighting. This was something rawer and more real. This was the moment where a man at the height of his power became vulnerable, and a woman who'd always lived in that vulnerability stood beside him anyway, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. As I lay in that hospital bed, holding Emma's hand, feeling my heart rate finally returning to normal, I understood that this was what my entire life had been leading toward. Not the surgery, not the recognition, not the tower of achievements I'd spent 15 years building. It was this moment, this connection, this choice to let someone else matter, and everything that came after would be built on this foundation, real, vulnerable, absolutely terrifying, and completely worth the risk. They discharged me from Massachusetts General on a Tuesday morning with a prescription for anxiety medication and a referral to a therapist. The irony of a surgeon needing mental health support wasn't lost on anyone. The nurses in the ICU were already making jokes about it. But Emma wasn't joking. She was taking me to her apartment, making me promise to rest, telling me that surgery was off the table for at least 2 weeks while I recovered and figured out what my body had been trying to tell me through the language of cardiac symptoms. "Your body is smarter than your mind," Emma said, sitting on the edge of her bed while I lay back against pillows that smelled like lavender detergent. "Your mind was still trying to convince you that everything was fine, that you were handling all this opposition and pressure without any problem. Your body knew the truth." I'd never been to Emma's apartment before. This was new territory, small space, every corner filled with intention. Books everywhere, novels, poetry, medical journals about palliative care, cookbooks with pages marked and annotated, photographs of her family on the walls. Her life, laid out in a way that felt infinitely more real than my sterile apartment with its designer furniture and carefully curated art collection. "Tell me something about you that I don't know," I said, pulling her down to sit beside me. "I'm terrified that you're going to wake up one day and realize that I'm not enough," she said. "That I'll never be impressive enough, that you'll start resenting me for not being in your world, that eventually you'll leave because I can't give you the status and recognition that you've spent your entire life chasing." "That's not going to happen," I said. "You don't know that," she said. "You think you do right now, but you don't." I took her hand. "Then help me know that. Help me understand what it would mean to actually choose you over everything else." "Because that's what I want to do, Emma. I want to choose you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We should probably go on an actual date before you start proposing to me in hospital beds and making grand declarations." 2 days later, I was cleared to leave her apartment for short periods. Emma had to work her overnight shift, and I was going crazy from inactivity. I did what I always did when I was anxious. I planned. I researched. I plotted out something that would be perfect, that would demonstrate my transformation from arrogant surgeon to someone who actually understood what mattered. I called Emma's mother. I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I found her number in Emma's contacts and called her. "Mrs. Patterson," I said when a woman answered. "My name is Marcus Sterling. I'm your daughter's boyfriend." There was a long pause. "Emma mentioned you. She said you were a doctor who learned how to be human in the darkness." "That's accurate," I said. "I'm calling because I need your help. I want to plan something for Emma, something that shows her that I understand who she is and what matters to her. And I need to know, what was one of Emma's favorite things to do when she was younger? Before the career, before the responsibility, when she was just being herself?" Emma's mother, whose name was Patricia, told me that Emma used to spend hours in the library when she was a kid. Not studying, just reading, everything. Novels and poetry and essays. She loved words. She loved stories. She loved the way that literature could capture feelings that regular conversation couldn't quite reach. That's when I knew exactly what I was going to do. I spent the next 3 days making calls and sending emails. I contacted the Boston Public Library and explained what I was looking for. I reached out to a local bookbinder and described a project. I called Emma's best friend, a woman named Sarah who worked in marketing and who had opinions about everything and who immediately understood what I was trying to do. "Oh my God," Sarah said, "you're going to make her cry." "She's going to absolutely lose it." "Is that good?" I asked. "It's perfect," Sarah said. "Do you want my help?" What I created was a book. Not a regular book, but something commissioned from a local bindery. A collection of Emma's favorite poems, all printed on beautiful paper, all bound together with her name embossed on the spine. I wrote an introduction explaining why I'd done this, trying to articulate what she'd taught me about the value of presence, about the way that seeing someone completely was the most profound form of love. I also called the Boston Public Library and reserved their reading room for one evening. I arranged for candles, not too many, just enough to create an atmosphere that felt intimate rather than like a fire hazard. I somehow convinced Rosa at our coffee shop to deliver pastries to the library at a specific time. When I picked Emma up from the hospital at 6 in the morning after her overnight shift, She was exhausted and confused. "You're supposed to be resting," she said. "I've been resting," I said. "And I'm going crazy. I want to show you something." I drove her through Boston as the sun was coming up, not telling her where we were going. She kept asking, and I kept deflecting. By the time we arrived at the Boston Public Library, she was oscillating between amused and genuinely concerned about my mental state. "Why are we at the library?" she asked. "Because this is where you belong," I said. "Come on." I led her to the reading room, which I decorated with almost comical subtlety. String lights that made it look like we were inside a constellation, flowers on the table, the bound book sitting in the center of everything. Emma walked in and just stopped. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I collected your favorite poems," I said. "All the ones you've mentioned, all the ones you've quoted to me, all the ones that meant something to you, and I had them bound, and I wanted to read them to you, because you've been reading things to me, teaching me since the moment we met, and I wanted to do that for you." Emma opened the book with trembling hands. She read my introduction, and I watched her face as she did, watching the moment when understanding shifted into emotion. Tears started streaming down her face, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, which seemed like a very Emma thing to do. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. "That's because you've spent your entire life making other people's moments beautiful," I said. "I wanted to make one for you." We sat there for hours. I read poems to her, Mary Oliver and Sylvia Plath, and Maya Angelou and Neruda in translation. We talked about what the poems meant to us, about the way that language could capture something that regular conversation couldn't, about how stories and poetry and literature were all ways of saying you're not alone in feeling this way. Around noon, Rosa arrived with pastries and coffee, and Emma laughed so hard she cried again when she realized I'd coordinated an entire network of people to make this moment happen. She kept saying it was too much, it was perfect, it was insane. She couldn't believe I'd done all this. "I've spent my entire life being impressed with myself," I said. "I wanted to spend some time being impressed with you instead. Because you are impressive, Emma. Not because you're a surgeon or because you have a fancy title. You're impressive because you know how to love people completely, because you know how to show up, because when someone is falling apart, you don't try to fix them. You just sit with them in the darkness until they figure out how to find the light again." Emma took my hand. "I love you," she said. "I'm terrified that this is going to fall apart. I'm terrified that I'm not enough and that you're going to leave. But I love you so much that I'm willing to be terrified. I'm going to ask you a question," I said, "and I want you to answer honestly. Do you want to marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Not someday. Not when things are perfect. Not when you've thought about it more. Do you want to marry me now?" "Yes," she said again. "But you're supposed to do this properly. There's supposed to be a ring and a formal proposal and—" I pulled out the ring I'd bought 3 days earlier, when I was still supposed to be resting but had instead driven to Newberry Street and spent 6 hours at a jewelry store trying to find something that felt right. The moment I saw it, I knew. It was vintage, 1940s, with an understated elegance that felt like it belonged to Emma, not flashy, not trying to prove anything. Just beautiful in the way that things that know their own worth can be beautiful. "I'm doing it properly right now," I said, getting down on one knee in the Boston Public Library reading room with string lights overhead and flowers on the table, and Emma looking at me like I was the most ridiculous and wonderful person she'd ever encountered. "Emma Patterson, I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to become the person you already are. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, and she was crying again, and I was kissing her, and the moment felt like everything in my life had been leading toward this point where I finally understood that achievement meant nothing without someone to share it with. This was the first peak. This was the moment where everything that had been building, the opposition, the vulnerability, the choice to love someone completely, culminated in a simple yes. In a yes that changed the trajectory of both our lives. We called everyone immediately. Her family. My family. Sarah was dispatched to spread the news throughout the hospital. By the time we got back to work, Emma for her shift, me for a consultation that my therapist insisted I go to, because being healed doesn't mean isolating yourself from work. It means learning to work healthily. The entire hospital knew. The congratulations were genuine. But so was the underlying disapproval from certain quarters. Vanessa sent a gift with a card that said, "I hope you'll be very happy together," which was clearly a passive-aggressive way of saying, "This won't last." My mother called and said she was worried about what this meant for my career, which was her way of saying, "I wanted better for you." Connor texted Emma something that sounded like acceptance, like he'd finally understood that she wasn't coming back to him, that this was real. Planning a wedding seemed like it should have been a simple thing, but nothing about Emma and me was simple. We couldn't agree on anything. She wanted it small and intimate. I wanted to invite everyone I'd ever met. She wanted to get married at City Hall. I wanted the hospital chapel. She wanted to elope. I wanted our families to be present. "This is what it's going to be like forever," Emma said one night, frustrated after we'd had our third argument about wedding music. "We're never going to agree on anything. We're from completely different worlds. We agree on the important things," I said. "We agree that we want to spend our lives together. Everything else is just details." "Details matter," she said. "They do," I acknowledged, "but not as much as this. Not as much as us." We eventually compromised, which I was learning was the real skill of a sustainable relationship, not passion, but compromise. The wedding would be at the hospital chapel, but with a small guest list. No elaborate reception, but a dinner afterward with the people who actually mattered. Emma would wear a white dress because she wanted to, but it would be simple and elegant rather than expensive and complicated. The night before the wedding, I did something traditional and probably stupid. I slept at my apartment instead of with Emma. My best friend from medical school, a guy named James, came over with whiskey and cigars that he insisted were part of the last night of freedom ritual. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, but he was smiling when he said it. "She's going to drive you crazy." "Probably," I agreed, "but I'd rather be driven crazy by her than be at peace without her. I spent too many years at peace. I spent too many years alone." "That's the anxiety talking," James said. "No," I said. "That's the clarity talking. For the first time in my life, I actually know what I want. And it's not success. It's not recognition. It's her. It's waking up next to her. It's figuring out the small frustrations and compromises that come with actually sharing your life with someone. It's being known completely and choosing to stay anyway." James raised his glass. "To being known and choosing to stay," he said. The wedding was simple and perfect, and nothing like the elaborate event I might have imagined a year earlier. Emma's family was there, my mother was there, and by the end of the ceremony she was crying in a way that suggested she'd finally understood that this wasn't a mistake. This was a transformation. Sarah was there as Emma's maid of honor, making jokes about how she'd always known Emma and I were meant to be together from the moment Emma started talking about the arrogant surgeon who didn't know how to human. I waited at the altar in the chapel, and when Emma came down the aisle, everything else disappeared. There was just her. Just the woman who'd shown me how to love, how to be vulnerable, how to let someone matter more than my own pride. The vows we'd written for each other were honest in a way that most wedding vows aren't. They weren't about forever perfection. They were about choosing each other on the hard days. They were about sitting with each other in the darkness. They were about learning and growing, and sometimes failing and trying again. "I promise to see you," I said, my voice shaking. "Not the version of you that I wanted you to be, not the version of you that I think you should be, but the actual you in all your complexity and contradiction. I promise to show up. I promise to be present. I promise to love you even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. I promise that you will never be alone again." Emma's vows were about acceptance, about accepting that I was going to be a work in progress, about accepting that love was a daily choice, not a feeling that happened to you, about accepting that the best parts of life came from vulnerability and risk. When the priest said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," I kissed her, and the chapel erupted in applause. It felt like the most important moment of my life. It felt like everything had been leading to this, not the surgery, not the recognition, not the achievement, this moment, this commitment, this promise to build a life with someone who saw me completely. We honeymooned for a week in the mountains of Vermont, staying in a cabin that had no cell service and no internet and no way to be reached by the hospital. Emma took me hiking, actual physical hiking, which revealed that my years of sedentary work had left me completely unprepared for cardiovascular exertion. We read books together. We cooked meals together. We made love and talked about our fears and laughed at how unprepared we both were for this. On the last night of our honeymoon, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Emma said something that would matter more than I could possibly have known in that moment. "I think I want to have a baby," she said. I looked at her. "Really?" "Really," she said. "With you. I want to build a life with you that includes that. I want to see you as a father. I think you'd be good at it. You've learned how to care about people instead of just being impressed with yourself." "That might take some planning," I said. "We should probably talk about timing and—" "Or we could just live our lives and see what happens," Emma interrupted. "You've spent enough time planning, Marcus. Maybe it's time to just experience things." So we stopped using birth control. We didn't make a big deal out of it. We didn't track anything or obsess over it or turn something that should be joyful into something that required optimization. We just lived. We worked. We loved. We existed in the day-to-day rhythm of being married to someone. 3 months later, I was in surgery, a pediatric cardiac reconstruction on a 7-year-old boy with a complex defect, when my phone buzzed in the locker room. I didn't see it until after I'd scrubbed out, after the surgery had gone beautifully, after I'd spent 6 hours doing the thing I actually loved, saving lives. The text was from Emma. "Take a break. Come to the ICU when you can." My heart rate spiked. Someone had been admitted, someone I knew. But when I got to the ICU, Emma was standing there with a different kind of emergency. She was holding 2 pregnancy tests, both of them positive, and she was crying and laughing and looking at me like I was the only person in the world who could understand what this moment meant. "We're having a baby," she said. "We're having a baby. And I had to tell you in the ICU, because apparently that's where all the important moments of our life happen." I picked her up and spun her around, which was probably not appropriate hospital behavior, but I couldn't seem to help myself. We were having a baby. We were going to create a life together. We were going to become parents. This was the 4th peak, the moment of discovery, the moment of knowing that our love had created something new. For the first 3 months of the pregnancy, Emma was fine. She worked her shifts. She managed her nausea with ginger and determination. But around month 4, things started to get complicated. She developed gestational diabetes, which required careful monitoring and dietary adjustments. She developed preeclampsia symptoms that had to be watched constantly. Every checkup became a possibility of bad news, and I found myself living in the same space of uncertainty that I'd tried to avoid my entire career. "You're stressed," Emma said one evening, finding me in my office staring at research papers about maternal complications. "You're my wife," I said, "and you're carrying our baby. I'm allowed to be stressed." "You're allowed to be stressed," she agreed. "But you're not allowed to try to fix this by being in control. This is biological. This is beyond your expertise. This is just what sometimes happens when you have a baby, and we're going to deal with it together." She was right, of course. Emma was usually right. But it didn't make the uncertainty any easier. 6 months into the pregnancy, Emma was doing her rounds in the ICU when she started having sharp pains. She immediately sat down, and one of her colleagues called for a nurse, not understanding that Emma was the nurse, that Emma was the person everyone called when something was wrong. I was in my office when I got the call. "It's probably nothing," the ER resident said. "Preeclampsia symptoms. We're running tests." I left my patient files mid-review and ran to the ER. Emma was in a bed, and she was trying to reassure me while simultaneously being genuinely frightened, and I realized that this was what all those people had been feeling when I'd been treating them. This combination of trying to be brave and being absolutely terrified. The doctors ordered bed rest, strict bed rest, no more work, no more activity, just lying in bed, waiting for the baby to develop enough that delivery would be safer than continuing the pregnancy. For Emma, a woman who'd defined herself through her work, through her presence with patients, this felt like a kind of death. I took a leave of absence from surgery. I told the hospital that my family took priority. I set up a bed in our apartment, and I became Emma's caretaker the way she'd been mine months earlier. I brought her meals. I read to her. I sat with her while she cried about missing her patients, about feeling useless, about the fear that something would go wrong. "It won't," I said. "We're going to get through this. The baby's going to be fine. You're going to be fine." "You don't know that," she said. "You spent your whole life pretending you knew things you couldn't possibly know. You can't guarantee this, Marcus." "I know," I said, "but I believe it." And I believe in us. And I believe that we've been through enough darkness together that we know how to find the light again. 2 weeks into bed rest, Emma's blood pressure spiked again. The doctors made the decision to induce labor early. At 34 weeks, our baby was ready to meet us, and the safest thing for both Emma and the baby was to not wait any longer. This was the final peak. This was the moment where everything we'd been through, the opposition, the anxiety attack, the wedding, the pregnancy, all of it, culminated in the birth of our daughter. Emma was in labor for 18 hours. I was there for every minute of it. I held her hand. I witnessed her strength in a way that made me understand that I'd never actually seen true strength before I watched this woman bring a human being into the world. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for things to be easier. She just did what her body needed to do, and I sat there amazed at the miracle of it. When our daughter was born, at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in the same hospital where Emma and I had first met, where we'd sat in darkness together, everything changed again. The doctor placed this tiny, perfect human on Emma's chest, and I watched my wife look at our daughter with an expression that contained every emotion I'd ever learned about love. "She's perfect," Emma whispered. "She's absolutely perfect." I held her hand. I looked at my daughter, our daughter, and I understood in that moment what all the years of achievement had been missing. This exact moment. This tiny human who was half me and half Emma, who would grow up knowing what it meant to be loved completely, who would never have to learn as an adult that connection mattered more than accomplishment because she'd be surrounded by that message her entire life. "What should we name her?" I asked. Emma looked at me, and she smiled that smile that had changed my life. "Clara," she said, "after my grandmother. But Marcus, I want her middle name to be Grace. Clara Grace, our daughter, our miracle, the physical manifestation of everything that had brought us together." As I held Clara for the first time, as I felt the impossible smallness of her, as I understood that I would now spend the rest of my life protecting and loving this human being and her mother, I thought about the arrogant surgeon I'd been, the man who'd thought achievement was everything, the man who'd lived in a tower of his own importance. That man was gone, and I was grateful for his absence. Because now I knew something that no amount of surgical success could have taught me. The most important things in life aren't things you can accomplish alone. They're things you have to build with someone else. They're moments that only matter if you're fully present for them. They're connections that require vulnerability and risk, and the willingness to let someone see you completely. I looked at Emma, holding our daughter, exhausted and beautiful, and absolutely glowing with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you've just done something impossible. I thought about everything that had brought us here, the blackout, the darkness, the moment when I didn't know what I was doing, and she'd guided me, the coffee shops and the farmers markets and the library, the opposition and the obstacles, and the choice we'd made every single day to keep choosing each other. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" Emma asked. "For not giving up on me, for showing me how to live, for choosing me even when I wasn't worth choosing." Emma looked at me with that expression that had become so familiar to me, that expression that said she saw me completely and loved me anyway. "You were always worth choosing," she said. "You just didn't know it yet. You had to learn it, and I got to be the person who got to teach you." Clara made a small sound, and Emma shifted her to look at her daughter's face. In that moment, in that hospital room where everything had started, where darkness had transformed into light, I understood that this was what my entire life had been leading toward. Not the surgery, not the recognition, not the climb up a ladder that didn't actually go anywhere. This moment, this woman, this child, this family we'd built together. The three of us sat there as the sun came up over Boston, as the hospital began its morning routine, as the world outside continued on with its own dramas and conflicts and obstacles. But in that room, there was just peace, just clarity, just the profound understanding that I'd found what I was actually looking for my entire life. And now I needed to figure out how to spend the rest of my life being worthy of it. A final reflection. Life teaches you lessons in moments you don't expect. It teaches you that the things you think matter most, achievement, success, recognition, are actually just distractions from what actually matters. It teaches you that vulnerability is strength. It teaches you that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose every single day, in small ways and large ways. If you're watching this, if you're listening to my story, I want you to ask yourself something. What are you chasing? What achievement are you climbing toward? What recognition do you think will finally make you feel complete? Because I'm here to tell you that it won't. That when you get to the top of that ladder, you'll find that it was leaning against the wrong building the entire time. That the real thing, the actual transformation that will change your entire life, isn't something you can achieve alone. It's something you have to build with another person. It's something that requires risk and vulnerability and the willingness to be seen completely. The greatest gift I ever received wasn't handed to me. It was offered to me in darkness. It was offered by a woman with a flashlight in her mouth and a patient who was dying, and the calm determination to do what mattered. And I almost missed it because I was too busy being impressed with myself to notice that someone was trying to show me a different way to live. So tonight, when you go to bed, think about the people in your life who matter. Not the people who are impressed with you, but the people who see you, really see you. And ask yourself if you're showing up for them the way they deserve to be shown up for. Ask yourself if you're choosing them every single day in the small moments and the large ones. Because that's what this story is really about. It's not about a surgeon and a nurse. It's about two people who decided that connection mattered more than convenience. That vulnerability was worth the risk. That love, real love, not the fantasy version that movies sell you, is about showing up completely. I found that love in darkness. I built it in coffee shops and libraries and hospital rooms. I watched it grow into something that transformed both of us. And now I get to watch it continue to grow through my daughter, through the way we're teaching her that being fully present with another person is the most important thing you can possibly do. This is my story. This is my journey from arrogance to understanding, from achievement to connection, from living alone in a tower to building a life with someone who sees me completely. And I'm sharing it with you because I think you need to hear it. I think you need to know that transformation is possible, that it's never too late to choose differently, that the greatest love story of your life might be waiting for you in the most unexpected place, in the most unexpected person. You just have to be willing to step out of the darkness and let yourself be seen.